The hoarding of resources leads to poverty and to oppression. You see, when some people give in to the scarcity mindset, it always ends up leaving other people without their basic needs met. I want to give you a very timely example of what I'm talking about. It's a little bit of a history lesson, okay? So bear with me. In 1791, self-liberated slaves rose up against French colonial rule, and what became known as the Haitian Revolution began. 1791. It ended in 1804, with Haiti officially declaring its independence from France, but the French refused to recognize Haitian independence for another 20 years. Then, in 1825, King Charles X said that France would recognize Haiti's independence, but it would come with a cost. Haiti was required to pay former French slave owners 150 million francs because these slave owners claimed to have lost income when they could no longer enslave the Haitian people. 150 million francs, just to give you an idea, is the modern equivalent of about $21 billion. The French delivered this demand by sailing 14 battleships carrying over 500 cannons into Port-au-Prince, literally surrounding the island. Haitian refusal would have certainly meant another war and possibly complete annihilation. As one writer put it, this was not diplomacy, it was extortion. So Haiti agrees. They agree to pay 150 million francs to the French, a number that amounted to 10 times Haiti's annual budget. Guess who they had to borrow money from in order to keep from defaulting on their first two payments? French and American banks. And the fees and extremely high compounding interest only drove the debt higher and higher. And we, the United States, began profiting off of the Haitians as well. By the late 1800s, 80% of Haiti's wealth was devoted to paying off this debt. Like almost 100 years later, 80% of their wealth was devoted to paying this debt to former slave owners. In 1914, the National City Bank of New York, which is now Citibank, was a primary holder of Haitian debt. They actually pressured Woodrow Wilson's administration into sending Marines to occupy Haiti for the purpose of taking $500,000 from the Haitian reserves and bringing it back to the Citibank vaults because Haiti was late on a payment. Dan Sterling is a Virginia-based writer who writes for Forbes, and he's married to a Haitian national. In an article he wrote about this for Forbes, he says this: "My father-in-law," he's also Haitian, "still recalls the patriotic songs he was taught as a Haitian schoolboy. Its poignant lyrics urging all Haitians to reach into their own pockets and help the government raise the amount that was still owed to France. Thanks to voluntary contribution from Haiti's citizens, most of whom were desperately poor, the debt was finally settled in 1947. But decades of making regular payments had rendered the Haitian government chronically insolvent, helping to create a pervasive climate of instability from which the country still hasn't recovered. France's demand for reparations from Haiti seems comically outrageous to us today, equivalent to a kidnapper suing his escaped hostage for the cost of fixing a window that had been broken during the escape. While France still ranks among the world's wealthiest nations, Haiti, with a per capita income of $350, a power grid that fails on a regular basis, and a network of roads that's more than 50% unpaved, is plagued by drought, food shortages, and a struggling economy." Now, obviously, there have been other factors which have contributed to the conditions in Haiti today. Natural disasters and corrupt governments, just to name a few. But 122 years of paying reparations to their former enslavers has been absolutely crippling. After 35 years of American occupation, you see those Marines that Woodrow Wilson sent in, they actually ended up staying for almost 25 years, and then another 10 years of being on the committee that controlled all of the economics in Haiti. So after 35 years of American occupation and economic control, Haiti finally made their last payment, 1947, to Citibank. A scarcity mindset drove the colonizing French and Americans to believe that they needed to extract as much money as possible from this fledgling country. They had already stolen so many resources and literal lives from Africa and Haiti, but they were convinced that they needed to hoard even more. And the results for the Haitian people have been absolutely devastating. France had enough. The United States had enough. In fact, they had more than enough. But a scarcity mindset convinced them that they needed more. Today, y'all, Haiti has a per capita annual income almost 100 times lower than France, almost 200 times lower than us in the United States. According to Britannica, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere by a large margin and many measures, with 4/5 of its population living in absolute poverty. And they continue to struggle with violence and corruption and unrest. Now, when we learn all of that, it helps us understand why 15,000 Haitians came to our border seeking asylum this week. I'm not up here claiming to have all the answers. I just want us to see the catastrophic consequences of what happens when a scarcity mindset takes hold. When we take more than what we need. It's a zero-sum game. When we take more than we need, someone else doesn't have enough. Oppression, extortion, violence, and evil, all in the name of hoarding some extra resources. So how do we fight against this? How do we make this right? If Jesus taught us how to pray and he said, I want you to be a part of bringing heaven to earth, how do we bring heaven to earth in a situation like this? Well, God has already given us the answer. It's daily bread. While talking about this section of the Lord's Prayer, E.M. Bounds, the famous pastor and author, wrote this: bread for today is bread enough. Bread for today is bread enough. The Lord's Prayer is meant to be a daily reminder to rely on God for our enough and then to give our extra to anyone who doesn't have enough. It's that simple. We receive only what we need and we help others get what they need. And we expose scarcity for the lie that it is. There's plenty of bread to go around. If we will all stop hoarding resources and start sharing with others, we will find that there is more than enough for everyone. You see, we've made the grave mistake of believing that the answer to scarcity is affluence, but it's not. The opposite of scarcity isn't affluence. The opposite of scarcity is enough. The opposite of scarcity is not affluence. That's a lie. The opposite of scarcity is enough.